Snorkeling in crystal-clear waters, a paradise found. School of fish darted away, leaving an unnatural void. A shadow passed overhead, blocking out the sun. Frozen in terror as the massive form circled closer, a flick of its tail sent the snorkeler tumbling. The hunt was on and there was nowhere to hide. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the ORCA ATTACK story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The salty breeze whipped across Jack Hawkins' weathered face as he guided the Sea Whisper out of Kodiak Harbor. The 45-foot fishing vessel cut through the choppy waters, its bow rising and falling with each wave. Jack's calloused hands gripped the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon as the familiar coastline of Kodiak Island began to recede behind him. At 52, Jack was a seasoned commercial fisherman, his life etched into the lines on his face and the strength in his hands. He'd been working these waters for over 3 decades, and the rhythm of the sea was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Today was just another day, another chance to make a living from the bountiful Alaskan waters. As the Sea Whisper pushed further out to sea, Jack's deckhand Mike, a young man in his mid-20s, emerged from below deck. "Weather reports in, Jack," he called out over the roar of the engine and the crash of waves. "Looks like we're in for some chop, but nothing we can't handle." Jack nodded, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the horizon. "Good. We'll head to the usual spot. Should be some good hauls today if we're lucky." The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, its weak light barely penetrating the thick cloud cover. Jack guided the boat to his favorite fishing grounds, a spot he'd been frequenting for years. It was far enough out that most day trippers didn't bother, but close enough that he could make it back to port before nightfall if needed. As they approached the area, Jack noticed something in the distance. A flash of black and white, then another. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the shapes moving through the water. "Mike," he called out, "grab the binoculars. Tell me what you see." "Out there about 2 o'clock. Mike hurried to comply, raising the binoculars to his eyes and scanning the area Jack had indicated. After a moment, he lowered them, a hint of excitement in his voice. "Orcas, Jack. Looks like a pod of them." Jack grunted in acknowledgement. Orca sightings weren't uncommon in these waters, but they always put him on edge. He'd had run-ins with them before, nothing serious, but enough to make him wary. "How many?" Mike raised the binoculars again. "I count 5, maybe 6. Hard to tell, they're moving around a lot." "All right," Jack said, his tone measured. "We'll keep an eye on them, but we're here to fish. Let's get to work." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Jack and Mike worked in tandem, practiced movements born from countless days at sea. They cast their nets, the heavy mesh disappearing beneath the dark waters. Jack kept one eye on their work and one on the pod of orcas, which seemed content to stay at a distance for now. As they began to haul in their first catch, Jack felt a surge of satisfaction. The nets were heavy, a good sign. Fish flopped and writhed as they were pulled from the water, scales glinting in the weak sunlight. "Looks like a good haul, Jack," Mike called out, grinning as he helped secure the catch. Jack allowed himself a small smile. "Don't count your fish before they're in the hold, kid. We've got a long day ahead of us." They repeated the process, casting and hauling, casting and hauling. The hold began to fill, and Jack's earlier optimism grew. This could be one of their best days this season if their luck held. It was during their 4th haul that Jack noticed the change. The orcas, which had been keeping their distance, were suddenly much closer. He could see their distinctive black and white coloration clearly now, even without the binoculars. "Mike," he called out, his voice tense. "Keep an eye on those orcas. They're getting awful close." Mike looked up from where he was securing the latest catch, his eyes widening as he saw how near the pod had come. "Jesus, Jack. They're huge." Jack nodded grimly. Orcas were the apex predators of the sea, and these were prime specimens. The largest, likely a male, had a dorsal fin that must have been at least 6 feet tall. They moved through the water, with a grace that belied their massive size, circling closer to the boat with each pass. "What do we do?" Mike asked, a hint of fear creeping into his voice. "We keep working. Jack replied, his tone brooking no argument. "But we stay alert. They're probably just curious, but no sense in taking chances." They returned to their task, but the easy rhythm of before was gone. Every splash, every dark shape in the water, set them on edge. Jack found himself constantly scanning the water, dividing his attention between the nets and the circling predators. It happened so fast that at first, Jack wasn't sure what he'd seen. One moment, they were hauling in another net full of fish. The next, there was a flash of black and white, a tremendous splash, and suddenly their catch was significantly lighter. "Son of a bitch," Jack swore, watching as one of the orcas surfaced nearby, a large salmon clearly visible in its jaws. "They're going after our catch." Mike stared open-mouthed as the orca easily tossed the fish into the air before catching it again. It was almost playful, but Jack knew better. This was a calculated move, and it spelled trouble. "Get those fish in the hold now," Jack barked, spurring Mike into action. They worked frantically, trying to salvage what they could of their catch. But the orcas were faster, more agile in the water than they could ever hope to be. Time and, again, just as they thought they'd secured their haul, an orca would dart in, snatching fish from the net with surgical precision. It was like they were toying with the fishermen, always staying just out of reach. Jack's frustration mounted with each stolen fish. This was more than just a curious pod checking out the boat. This was a coordinated assault on their livelihood. He'd heard of orcas doing this before, learning to associate fishing boats with an easy meal, but he'd never experienced it firsthand. "We need to scare them off," he growled, more to himself than to Mike. He strode to the wheelhouse, flipping switches until a harsh mechanical tone blared out over the water. The sound was meant to deter seals and sea lions from the fishing grounds, and Jack hoped it might work on the orcas as well. For a moment, it seemed to work. The pod retreated, disappearing beneath the waves. Jack allowed himself a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. Within minutes, the orcas were back, seemingly unfazed by the noise. "It's not working, Jack," Mike called out, his voice tight with worry. "What do we do?" Jack gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They couldn't keep this up. At this rate, they'd lose most of their catch, turning what should have been a profitable day into a loss. But these were wild animals, apex predators, and he knew all too well how dangerous they could be if provoked. As he watched, the largest orca, the one with the towering dorsal fin, broke away from the others. It circled the boat once, twice, its movements deliberate and focused. Jack felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the frigid Alaskan air. "Mike," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Get below deck. Now." Mike opened his mouth to argue, but something in Jack's expression stopped him. He nodded once, then disappeared below. Jack stood alone on the deck, his eyes locked with those of the massive orca. In that moment, he felt the weight of his years at sea, the countless times he'd faced down storms and treacherous waters. But this was different. This was a battle of wills with a creature as intelligent as it was powerful. The orca surged forward, and Jack braced himself, unsure of what would come next. As the final rays of sunlight glinted off the dark waters, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, terrifying ordeal. Jack's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel of the Sea Whisper, his eyes never leaving the massive orca circling his boat. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck, painting the scene in an eerie golden light. The air was thick with tension, broken only by the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the occasional spray of water as the orcas breached nearby. "Mike!" Jack called out, his voice gruff with barely contained anxiety. "Get up here and bring the flare gun." Moments later, Mike scrambled onto the deck, his face pale and his hands clutching the bright orange flare gun. "What's the plan, Jack?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jack's steel-gray eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. The pod of orcas had spread out, forming a loose circle around the boat. The largest male, with its towering dorsal fin slicing through the water, continued to lead the charge, drawing ever closer to the Sea Whisper. "We need to scare them off," Jack growled, reaching for the flare gun. "These aren't just curious whales anymore. They're treating us like competition." With practiced ease, Jack loaded the flare and aimed skyward. The crack of the gun echoed across the water as a brilliant red streak arced into the air. For a moment, The world was bathed in a crimson glow, reflecting off the choppy waves and the sleek black and white bodies of the orcas. The pod scattered, disappearing beneath the surface in a flurry of waves and white foam. Jack allowed himself a momentary sigh of relief, but he knew better than to let his guard down. "Did it work?" Mike asked, peering over the side of the boat. Jack shook his head grimly. "Don't count on it, kid. Orcas are smart. Too smart sometimes. Keep your eyes peeled." As if on cue, a massive black shape erupted from the water mere yards from the boat. The male orca hung in the air for a split second, its massive body glistening in the fading light, before crashing back into the sea. The impact sent a spray of icy water across the deck, soaking both men. "Jesus Christ!" Mike yelped, stumbling backward. Jack stood his ground, his jaw set in determination. "They're not backing down," he muttered, more to himself than to Mike. "We need to get out of here." He turned to the wheelhouse, intent on firing up the engines and making a run for it. But before he could take 2 steps, a violent shudder ran through the boat. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as the male orca rammed the Sea Whisper's port side. "He's trying to capsize us!" Jack roared, grabbing onto the railing to steady himself. "Mike, get below and check for damage." As Mike disappeared, below deck, Jack raced to the wheelhouse. He fired up the engines, the familiar rumble providing a small measure of comfort in the chaos. Turning the wheel hard to starboard, he gunned the throttle, hoping to put some distance between them and the aggressive pod. The Sea Whisper lurched forward, cutting through the waves with increasing speed. Jack's eyes darted between the path, ahead and the roiling water around them, searching for signs of the orcas. For a moment it seemed they might escape. Then a dark shape appeared off the starboard bow, keeping pace with the boat with infuriating ease. The male orca's dorsal fin cut through the water like a knife, a silent challenge to Jack's attempted escape. "Come on, you bastard," Jack muttered through gritted teeth. "Give it up already." But the orca showed no signs of tiring. If anything, it seemed to be toying with them, easily matching the boat's speed while staying just out of reach. The rest of the pod fanned out behind their leader, creating a living barrier between the Sea Whisper and open water. Mike's voice crackled over the intercom, tinged with panic. "Jack, we're taking on water down here. The hit breached the hull." Jack swore colorfully, his mind racing. They were too far out to make it back to port with a damaged hull, and the orcas showed no signs of letting up. He needed a plan, and fast. "Mike, get up here and take the wheel," Jack ordered. "Keep us moving, but don't push the engines too hard. We can't risk taking on more water." As Mike clambered into the wheelhouse, visibly shaken but determined, Jack headed below deck to assess the damage. The acrid smell of seawater mixed with diesel fuel assaulted his nostrils as he made his way to the breach. The damage was worse than he'd feared. A jagged hole about 2 feet across gaped in the hull. Icy water poured in, already ankle-deep on the floor. Jack's mind flashed to the emergency repair kit he kept for situations like this, but he knew it would be a temporary fix at best. Working quickly, Jack pulled out sheets of rubber matting and a powerful adhesive. The noise of the engines and the crashing waves faded into the background as he focused on the task at hand, his movements precise despite the rocking of the boat. Just as he pressed the makeshift patch into place, another violent impact rocked the Sea Whisper. Jack lost his footing, slamming hard into the wall. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but he forced himself to ignore it. The patch held, but barely. Water still seeped in around the edges. "Jack!" Mike's panicked voice echoed down from above. "They're still coming!" Gritting his teeth against the pain, Jack made his way back to the deck. The scene that greeted him sent a chill down his spine. The orcas had tightened their circle, drawing ever closer to the boat. The male, seemingly emboldened by the success of its first attack, was preparing for another run. "Mike, kill the engines," Jack ordered, his voice calm despite the fear churning in his gut. Mike looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What? But they'll—" "Do it," Jack snapped. "Trust me, kid." As the engines sputtered to a stop, an eerie silence fell over the boat. The orcas continued to circle, their sleek bodies sliding through the water with predatory grace. Jack stood at the center of the deck, his eyes locked on the male orca. "What are you planning?" Mike whispered, coming to stand beside him. Jack didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, calculating risks and possibilities. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. Orcas are hunters, Mike. They're used to prey that runs. Sometimes, to beat a predator, you have to think like one. Before Mike could respond, Jack strode to the edge of the deck. In one fluid motion, he grabbed a length of rope and fashioned a quick lasso. The male orca was drawing closer, its massive body sliding just beneath the surface. "Jack, what are you—" Mike's question was cut short as Jack suddenly whirled the rope over his head and let it fly. The lasso sailed through the air, landing with surprising accuracy around the orca's dorsal fin. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. Then chaos erupted. The orca dove, the rope pulling taut with a sound like a gunshot. Jack braced himself against the railing, muscles straining as he held on. The other orcas scattered, their coordinated attack disrupted by this unexpected turn of events. "Mike, the winch!" Jack shouted over the splash of water and the creaking of the boat. Mike sprang into action, attaching the rope to the powerful winch used for hauling in their nets. As it began to turn, slowly pulling the massive orca closer to the boat, Jack allowed himself a grim smile. The orca thrashed in the water, its powerful tail sending up great plumes of spray. But with each turn of the winch, it was drawn inexorably closer to the sea whisper. The rest of the pod hung back, as if unsure how to react to this new development. Finally, the male orca's massive head broke the surface mere feet from the boat. Its dark eye, intelligent and filled with a mixture of fury and confusion, locked onto Jack's. "Listen here, you overgrown fish," Jack growled, leaning over the railing. "This is my territory, my livelihood. You want to play games? Fine. But remember, I've got years of experience dealing with the worst the sea can throw at me. You don't scare me." As if understanding his words, the orca went still. For a long moment, man and whale regarded each other, two apex predators locked in a battle of wills. Then, with a deliberate motion, Jack reached for his knife. The orca's eye followed his movement, a flicker of what might have been understanding, passing through its gaze. In one swift motion, Jack cut the rope. The orca didn't move immediately. It stayed there, floating at the surface, its eye still fixed on Jack. Then, with a powerful flick of its tail, it dove beneath the waves. The rest of the pod followed suit, disappearing into the depths as quickly as they had appeared. Mike let out a shaky breath. "Are they gone?" Jack nodded slowly, his eyes still scanning the water. "For now, but we're not out of the woods yet. That hull breach is going to be a problem." As if on cue, the boat gave an ominous lurch. The temporary patch Jack had applied was holding, but only just. They were still taking on water, and night was falling fast. "Mike, radio for help," Jack ordered, already moving towards the wheelhouse. "Tell them we've got hull damage and we're taking on water. And mention the orcas. They'll want to know about that." As Mike hurried to comply, Jack allowed himself a moment to slump against the wheel. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the wall, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving him feeling every one of his 52 years. But as he looked out over the darkening sea, a fierce pride welled up in his chest. They'd faced down one of the ocean's most formidable predators and lived to tell the tale. Whatever challenges the night might bring, Jack knew they'd face them, head on. With a deep breath, he straightened up and turned his attention to the task at hand. The immediate danger might have passed, but the night was young, and the sea was unforgiving. As he plotted their course back to safe harbor, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with the orcas was far from over. The sea whisper limped through the darkening Alaskan waters, her damaged hull groaning with each passing wave. Jack stood at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The radio crackled intermittently, the Coast Guard's reassurances doing little to ease the tension that hung thick in the air. "How are we looking, Mike?" Jack called out, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Mike emerged from below deck, his face grim and his clothes soaked with seawater. "Not good, Jack. The patch is holding, but barely. We're still taking on water, just slower now." Jack nodded, processing the information. "And the pumps? Running full tilt, but they can't keep up forever," Mike replied, running a hand through his salt-crusted hair. "How long till the Coast Guard gets here?" Before Jack could answer, a dark shape broke the surface of the water off their port side. The male orca's dorsal fin sliced through the waves, a silent reminder that their ordeal was far from over. "Damn it," Jack muttered. "They're back." Mike's eyes widened in fear. "I thought we scared them off." Jack shook his head grimly. "We bought some time, that's all. These aren't just animals, Mike. They're intelligent and they've got a score to settle." As if to emphasize his point, another orca surfaced on their starboard side. Then another. Within moments, the Sea Whisper was once again surrounded by the pod. "What do we do?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack's mind raced, weighing their options. The boat was damaged, taking on water, and they were still hours away from the nearest safe harbor. Fighting off the orcas had been difficult, enough in daylight. In the gathering darkness, it would be nearly impossible. "We keep moving," Jack finally said, his voice steely with determination. "We can't outrun them, but we can't afford to stop either. Get on the radio and update the Coast Guard. Tell them to step on it." As Mike hurried to the radio, Jack focused on keeping the boat steady. The orcas had begun to circle again, their movements more aggressive than before. The male, easily identifiable by its towering dorsal fin, led the charge, drawing ever closer to the wounded vessel. Suddenly, the boat shuddered violently. Jack stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing as the orca rammed them again. "Hold on," he shouted, gripping the wheel with all his strength. The attack continued, each impact more violent than the last. Jack could hear the hull creaking and groaning under the assault, the temporary patch straining to hold back the sea. Mike staggered back into the wheelhouse, his face pale. "Coast Guard still an hour out," he reported, clinging to the doorframe as another blow rocked the boat. "Jack, we're not going to make it." Jack gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They needed a plan, and fast. His eyes darted around the wheelhouse, searching for anything that might give them an edge. They landed on the emergency flare gun, still loaded from their earlier attempt to scare off the orcas. "Mike, take the wheel," Jack ordered, grabbing the flare gun. "Keep us steady as you can." Ignoring Mike's confused protests, Jack made his way out onto the deck. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the icy bite of the Alaskan night. Waves crashed over the sides of the boat, soaking Jack to the skin in seconds. But he barely noticed the cold. His attention focused entirely on the circling predators. The male orca surfaced again, its massive body gleaming in the dim light of the moon. Jack raised the flare gun, taking careful aim. He knew he'd only get one shot at this. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered through clenched teeth. Just a little closer. The orca dove, disappearing beneath the waves. Jack held his breath, waiting. 1 second passed. 2, 3. Then, with an explosion of water, the orca breached. Its enormous body hung in the air for a split second, poised to crash down onto the boat. Jack fired. The flare streaked through the night, a blazing comet of red light. It struck the orca square in the side just as it began to fall. The whale let out a deafening cry, more of surprise than pain, and twisted away from the boat. For a moment, the sea around them was illuminated in an eerie, blood-red glow. The other orcas scattered, startled by the sudden light and their leader's cry. "Did you get him?" Mike shouted from the wheelhouse. "I don't know," Jack called back, his eyes scanning the churning water. "But I think we've just made them angry." As if in response to his words, the sea erupted around them. The orcas returned with a vengeance, their coordinated attacks now fueled by rage. They slammed into the boat from all sides, their powerful bodies threatening to tear the Sea Whisper apart. Jack stumbled back to the wheelhouse, his legs nearly giving out as another impact rocked the boat. "We need to abandon ship," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Mike stared at him in disbelief. "What? But the life raft? In this water?" "We don't have a choice," Jack cut him off. "The hull's not going to hold much longer. At least in the raft we'll have a chance." Even as he spoke, a sickening crack echoed through the boat. Water began to pour in faster, the pumps whining in protest as they struggled to keep up. "Go!" Jack shouted, pushing Mike towards the emergency raft. "I'll send out a mayday." As Mike scrambled to deploy the life raft, Jack turned to the radio. His fingers flew over the controls, muscle memory taking over as he broadcast their dire situation. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the fishing vessel Sea Whisper. We are approximately 30 nautical miles southwest of Kodiak Island. Hull breach taking on water. Abandoning ship. Hostile orca pod in the vicinity. Request immediate assistance. I say again. Jack repeated the message, praying it would get through. As he finished, another violent impact nearly knocked him off his feet. The boat lurched sickeningly, listing to one side. "Jack, the raft's ready." Mike's panicked voice carried over the howling wind. Abandoning the radio, Jack made his way back to the deck. The life raft bobbed in the turbulent water, looking impossibly small against the vast, dark sea. Mike was already inside, his face a mask of fear and determination. Jack was about to jump in when movement caught his eye. The male orca had surfaced again, its massive body sliding through the water with deadly grace. Its eye, intelligent and filled with what Jack could only describe as malice, was fixed squarely on him. Time seemed to slow. Jack could see every detail of the orca's approach, the scars on its skin, the powerful muscles rippling beneath the surface, the light of the moon reflected in its obsidian eye. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that this was it, the final confrontation. "Jack, come on!" Mike's desperate cry snapped him back to reality. With a final glance at the approaching orca, Jack leapt for the life raft. He hit the inflated side awkwardly, scrambling to pull himself in as Mike reached out to help. Just as Jack's legs cleared the water, the orca struck. Its massive jaws clamped down on the spot where Jack had been moments before, the sound of teeth snapping shut echoing across the water. "Cut the line!" Jack roared, fumbling for his knife. Mike was faster, slashing through the rope that tethered them to the sinking sea whisper. The life raft lurched away, carried by the wind and waves. For a moment, all they could do was cling to the sides of the raft, gasping for breath. The sea whisper groaned one final time before slipping beneath the waves, leaving them alone in the vast, unforgiving ocean. But they weren't alone. The orcas circled their tiny raft, their dorsal fins cutting through the water like knives. The male, still enraged from the flare, led the charge. "What do we do now?" Mike asked, his voice barely audible over the wind and waves. Jack's mind raced. They were exposed, vulnerable. The life raft, designed to keep them afloat, offered no protection against determined predators. He reached for the emergency kit, praying there might be something, anything, they could use. His hand closed around a small cylindrical object, a bioluminescent marker, designed to help rescuers spot them in the dark. An idea began to form. "Mike," Jack said, his voice low and urgent, "when I say now, I need you to splash the water. Make as much noise as you can." Mike nodded, not understanding but trusting Jack implicitly. Jack waited, watching the orcas circle ever closer. The male was preparing for another pass, its massive body coiling like a spring beneath the waves. "Now!" Jack shouted. As Mike began to thrash and splash, Jack cracked the bioluminescent marker. A bright, unearthly green light spilled out, illuminating the dark water around them. He thrust it into the sea, creating a glowing pool of light. The effect was immediate. The orcas, their eyes adapted to the dark depths, recoiled from the sudden alien light. They veered away, their coordinated attack falling into disarray. "Keep it up," Jack encouraged, grabbing another marker and activating it. For several tense minutes they continued their desperate defense. Each time the orcas regrouped and approached, Jack and Mike would create another pool of bioluminescent light, driving them back. Gradually the attacks began to lessen. The orcas, confused and frustrated by this strange new tactic, began to pull back. Even the male, still seething with rage, seemed reluctant to approach the eerie green glow. Finally, with a last baleful look at the tiny raft, the male orca turned and dove deep. The rest of the pod followed, disappearing into the inky depths of the Alaskan waters. Jack and Mike sat in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe it was over. The bioluminescent light cast a ghostly glow over their faces, highlighting the exhaustion and fear etched into their features. "Are they gone?" Mike finally asked, his voice hoarse. Jack nodded slowly, his eyes still scanning the water. "I think so, for now at least." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of their situation set in. They were adrift in the frigid Alaskan waters, their boat gone with only a small life raft between them and the unforgiving sea. The orcas might be gone, but they were far from safe. "What now?" Mike asked, huddling closer to Jack as the cold began to seep into their bones. Jack looked up at the star-filled sky, searching for any sign of approaching rescue. "Now," he said, his voice filled with grim determination, "we survive." As they settled in for a long cold night, the bioluminescent markers continued to glow, a beacon of hope in the vast dark ocean. The attack was over, but their ordeal was far from finished. The sea, Jack knew, was unforgiving, but so was he. Whatever challenges the night might bring, they would face them together, two men against the endless Alaskan wilderness. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale, ethereal light across the choppy Alaskan waters. Jack Hawkins blinked awake, his body stiff and aching from a night spent huddled in the small life raft. Beside him, Mike stirred, his young face etched with lines of exhaustion and fear. "Any sign of rescue?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse from the cold night air. Jack scanned the horizon, squinting against the glare of the rising sun. The vast expanse of ocean stretched out in every direction, empty and unforgiving. "Nothing yet," he replied grimly. "But they'll come. Coast Guard doesn't give up easy." As if to mock his words, a dark fin sliced through the water barely 50 yards from their raft. Jack's heart sank as he recognized the towering dorsal fin of the male orca that had led the attack on the Sea Whisper. "They're still out there," he murmured, more to himself than to Mike. Mike followed his gaze, his face paling as he spotted the fin. "I thought they'd given up," he whispered, fear evident in his voice. Jack shook his head slowly. "Orcas are smart, kid. Too smart sometimes. They're patient hunters. They know we're vulnerable out here." The orca submerged, disappearing beneath the waves. For a moment all was quiet save for the gentle lapping of water against the sides of the raft. Then, barely a stone's throw away, the massive predator breached. Its enormous body hung in the air for a split second, water cascading off its sleek black and white skin, before crashing back into the sea with a thunderous splash. The impact sent a wave towards the raft, rocking it violently. Jack and Mike clung to the sides, their knuckles white with the effort of holding on. "It's toying with us," Jack growled, his eyes never leaving the spot where the orca had disappeared. "What do we do?" Mike asked, panic edging into his voice. Before Jack could answer, another fin appeared, then another. The rest of the pod had joined their leader, forming a loose circle around the tiny raft. Jack's mind raced, assessing their options. The bioluminescent markers that had saved them the night before would be useless in the bright morning light. They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves if the orcas decided to attack. "We need to find land," Jack said finally, his voice low and urgent. "Even a small ice floe would give us some advantage." Mike nodded, his eyes darting nervously between the circling fins. "But how? We don't have any way to propel the raft." Jack reached into the emergency kit, pulling out a collapsible paddle. It was small, meant more for steering than propulsion, but it was all they had. "We make do with what we've got," he said, handing the paddle to Mike. "You paddle, I'll keep watch. Any sign of trouble, you duck down into the raft, got it?" Mike took the paddle with shaking hands but nodded firmly. As he began to paddle, Jack kept his eyes on the orcas, watching for any sign of aggression. The raft moved agonizingly slowly through the water. Jack had chosen a direction at random, hoping against hope that they might stumble upon land or at least a large enough piece of ice to give them some respite. For hours they continued like this. Mike paddled until his arms shook with exhaustion, then Jack would take over while Mike kept watch. All the while the orcas followed, sometimes drawing so close that Jack could see the scars on their skin, other times falling back until they were just dark shapes on the horizon. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature rose, bringing with it an unexpected problem. The ice that dotted the ocean's surface began to melt and break apart. What had once been large, stable floes were now smaller, more treacherous chunks. "Jack!" Mike called out suddenly, pointing ahead. "Look!" In the distance, a larger ice floe loomed. It was far from ideal, maybe 20 feet across at its widest point, but compared to their tiny raft, it looked like solid ground. "Good. Aye, kid," Jack said, allowing himself a small smile. "Let's make for it." They redoubled their efforts, paddling with renewed vigor towards the ice floe. But as they drew closer, Jack's heart sank. The orcas had noticed their change in direction and were closing in fast. Come on, Jack muttered, willing the raft to move faster. They were less than 50 yards from the ice when the first orca struck. It rammed the raft from below, nearly capsizing it. Jack and Mike clung on desperately, water sloshing over the sides and soaking them to the skin. Hold on, Jack shouted, as another orca passed frighteningly close to the raft, its wake rocking them violently. Mike had abandoned the paddle and was now lying flat in the bottom of the raft, his eyes wide with terror. Jack gritted his teeth and kept paddling, each stroke bringing them closer to the relative safety of the ice floe. 20 yards. The male orca breached again, this time so close that Jack felt the spray of its impact. 10 yards. Another ram. From below, weaker this time, but still enough to make Jack's heart race. 5 yards. Jack could see every crack and crevice in the ice now. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope. With a final desperate lunge, Jack drove the paddle into the water. The raft surged forward, scraping against the edge of the ice floe. In one fluid motion, born of years at sea and sheer survival instinct, Jack grabbed Mike by the collar of his life vest and hurled him onto the ice before scrambling up himself. They lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the cold of the ice seeping through their wet clothes. The sound of splashing made Jack look up. The orcas were circling the ice floe, their dorsal fins cutting through the water like knives. We made it, Mike breathed, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. Don't celebrate yet, kid, Jack warned, pushing himself to his feet. We're not out of this. As if to emphasize his point, the male orca suddenly lunged at the edge of the ice floe. Its massive jaws clamped down on the ice, sending cracks spiderwebbing out from the point of impact. A chunk of ice broke off and disappeared into the churning water. They're trying to break it up, Jack realized aloud, his mind racing. We need to get to the center. It'll be most stable there. They moved carefully across the ice, acutely aware of how precarious their footing was. The orcas continued their assault, ramming the ice floe from all sides. With each impact, more pieces broke off, shrinking their already small sanctuary. What's the plan, Jack? Mike asked, his teeth chattering from cold and fear. Jack looked around desperately. They were exposed here, with nowhere to hide and no way to defend themselves. His eyes landed on a slight rise in the center of the ice floe. It wasn't much, but it was the highest point available. Up there, he said, pointing. We make our stand there. They clambered up the small incline, the ice creaking ominously beneath their feet. From this vantage point, they could see the orcas clearly as they circled their shrinking island. The male orca surfaced directly in front of them, its intelligent eye fixed on Jack. For a moment, man and beast regarded each other, two apex predators locked in a battle of wills. What does it want? Mike whispered, unable to tear his gaze away from the massive creature. Jack's jaw tightened. Revenge, he said simply. We challenged it, hurt it. In its mind, we're a threat that needs to be eliminated. As if in response to his words, the orca dove, disappearing beneath the waves. The other members of the pod followed suit, vanishing one by one until the water around the ice floe was eerily still. Where did they go? Mike asked, his eyes darting around nervously. Jack didn't answer immediately. He was listening intently, every sense on high alert. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was screaming danger. Then he heard it, a low rumbling sound coming from beneath the ice. His eyes widened in realization. Brace yourself, he shouted, grabbing Mike and pulling him down. The next instant, the world exploded into chaos. The orcas burst through the ice from below, their massive bodies shattering their fragile refuge. Jack and Mike were thrown into the air, surrounded by flying shards of ice and frigid seawater. Time seemed to slow as Jack fell. He saw Mike flailing nearby, the orcas' sleek bodies cutting through the turbulent water, the pieces of the ice floe scattered like broken glass across the ocean's surface. Then reality came crashing back as he hit the water. The cold was like a physical blow driving the air from his lungs. Jack thrashed desperately, fighting to reach the surface, His head broke the water and he gasped for air, spinning around frantically. "Mike!" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Mike, where are you?" A splash to his left caught his attention. Mike surfaced, coughing and sputtering. Relief flooded through Jack, but it was short-lived. The orcas were regrouping, preparing for another attack. "The raft!" Jack shouted, spotting their life raft bobbing nearby, miraculously still intact. "Swim for the raft!" They struck out for the raft, their movements hampered by their waterlogged clothes and the numbing cold of the Alaskan waters. Jack could see the orcas approaching fast, their dorsal fins slicing through the water with terrifying speed. Just as Jack reached the raft, a dark shape loomed beneath him. He felt something brush against his leg, and then he was being pulled under. The male orca had him. Water filled his nose and mouth as he was dragged deeper. Jack kicked and thrashed, but it was like fighting against a freight train. His lungs burned, spots dancing at the edges of his vision. Just as he thought it was over, the pressure on his leg vanished. Jack kicked hard, propelling himself towards the surface. He broke through with a desperate gasp, coughing and retching. "Jack!" Mike's voice seemed to come from far away. "Jack, grab my hand." Through blurry eyes, Jack saw Mike leaning out of the raft, his arm extended. With the last of his strength, Jack reached out and clasped Mike's hand. Together they heaved, and Jack tumbled into the raft. For a moment, all Jack could do was lie there, gasping for air. Then Mike's urgent voice cut through his daze. "They're coming back!" Jack forced himself up, ignoring the pain that lanced through his body. The orcas were indeed regrouping, preparing for what could be their final assault. As he watched the approaching predators, a strange calm settled over Jack. They had survived the sinking of their boat, a night adrift at sea, and now this. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Get ready, Mike," he said, his voice steady despite their dire situation. "This isn't over yet." The orcas closed in, their massive bodies casting shadows over the tiny raft. Jack and Mike braced themselves, ready for whatever came next. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its unforgiving light over the vast Alaskan waters, the battle between man and nature reached its climax. The pursuit had led them here, to this moment, and now there was nowhere left to run. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the frigid Alaskan waters. Jack Hawkins and Mike huddled in their battered life raft, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding sea for any sign of the orcapod that had relentlessly pursued them. The cold had seeped into their bones, their clothes still damp from their earlier plunge into the icy waters. "How much longer do you think we can hold out, Jack?" Mike asked, his teeth chattering as he pulled the thin emergency blanket tighter around his shoulders. Jack's weathered face was grim as he surveyed their situation. "As long as we have to, kid. The Coast Guard knows our last position. They'll find us." As if on cue, a distant thrumming sound cut through the air. Both men's heads snapped up, eyes searching the sky. "Is that?" Mike's voice was barely above a whisper, hope and disbelief warring in his tone. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Helicopter. Sounds like a Jayhawk. Coast Guard's finest." The sound grew louder, and soon they could see the distinctive orange and white paint of the Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter appearing over the horizon. Jack fumbled in the emergency kit, pulling out a flare gun. "Get ready," he instructed Mike. "When they get closer, we'll need to signal them." As the helicopter drew nearer, Jack raised the flare gun and fired. A bright red streak arced through the air, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. The Jayhawk banked sharply, turning towards their position. "They've seen us," Mike shouted, waving his arms frantically. The helicopter circled overhead, its rotors whipping the sea into a frenzy. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "This is Coast Guard Rescue. We've got your position. Prepare for extraction." Relief washed over Jack, but it was short-lived. A dark shape cut through the water near their raft, followed by another, and another. The orca pod had returned. "Damn it," Jack muttered. Of all the times, the helicopter crew had spotted the danger as well. The voice came over the loudspeaker again, tension evident even through the static. "Be advised, we've spotted marine predators in your vicinity. Stay in your raft. We're sending down a rescue swimmer." Jack watched as a figure appeared in the EO, Helicopter's open door. The rescue swimmer, clad in a bright orange dry suit, gave a thumbs up before leaping into the churning sea below. "They're crazy," Mike said, his eyes wide as he watched the swimmer cutting through the waves towards them. "Those orcas are still out there." Jack's jaw was set, his eyes darting between the approaching swimmer and the circling orcas. "Coast Guard rescue swimmers are some of the toughest folks you'll ever meet. But yeah, this is going to be dicey." The swimmer reached their raft, his face a mask of determination beneath his protective goggles. "I'm Petty Officer Davis," he shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Are either of you injured?" "Banged up, but nothing serious," Jack replied. "But we've got bigger problems. Those orcas have been after us for hours. They're not giving up easy." Davis nodded grimly. "I saw them on the approach. We need to move fast. Who's going first?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Take the kid," he said, nodding towards Mike. "I'll hold things down here." Mike started to protest, but Jack cut him off with a stern look. "No arguments. You go now." As Davis began to secure Mike in the rescue harness, a massive form breached the surface nearby. The male orca, its dorsal fin standing tall above the waves, seemed to be eyeing the newcomer to its hunting grounds. "We've got company," Jack warned, his voice tense. Davis glanced over his shoulder, his movements becoming more urgent as he finished securing Mike. "Hang on tight," he instructed, before signaling to the helicopter. The winch began to pull them up, Mike and Davis rising slowly from the turbulent sea. Jack watched them ascend, his heart in his throat as he saw the orcas beginning to circle. Closer. Suddenly the male orca surged forward, its massive body cutting through the water with incredible speed. It was headed straight for the dangling figures of Mike and Davis. "Look out!" Jack shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the helicopter and the splash of waves. Time seemed to slow as Jack watched the scene unfold. The orca leaped, its enormous body breaching the surface, jaws open wide. Davis, spotting the danger, twisted in midair, putting his own body between the orca and Mike. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked as if the orca would snatch them right out of the air. But at the last second, Davis kicked out, his fin catching the orca across, its sensitive snout. The massive predator fell back with a tremendous splash, and Mike and Davis continued their ascent unharmed. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But his relief was short-lived as he realized his turn was next. The orcas, agitated by their failed attack, were now circling his small raft with renewed vigor. The helicopter lowered. Davis backed down, the rescue swimmer's face set in grim determination. "Ready?" he shouted as he neared the raft. Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving the circling predators. "Let's do this." As Davis secured the harness around Jack, the orcas began to close in. The male, still seeming to nurse a grudge from their earlier encounters, led the charge. "Hold on tight," Davis instructed as he signaled for the winch to pull them up. They had barely cleared the surface of the water when the orcas attacked. The pod surged forward as one, their massive bodies, creating a wall of churning water and flashing teeth. Jack felt a powerful impact as one of the orcas struck Davis's legs. The rescue swimmer grunted in pain but maintained his grip on Jack and the harness. "You okay?" Jack shouted over the chaos. Davis nodded tightly, his jaw clenched against the pain. "Been through worse, keep going up." But the orcas weren't done. As Jack and Davis ascended, the pod began to leap, their massive bodies breaching the surface again and again in attempts to snatch the humans from the air. Jack could feel the spray from their breaches, could see the intelligence burning in their eyes as they calculated each jump. It was a terrifying display of power and coordination. Halfway to the helicopter, disaster struck. The male orca, in a particularly powerful leap, managed to catch the edge of Davis's dry suit in its teeth. For a moment they were jerked downward, Davis's grip on the harness the only thing keeping them from plummeting back into the waiting jaws below. "Hold on!" Davis shouted, his voice strained with effort. Jack could hear the fabric of the dry suit tearing, could feel gravity pulling them down towards the roiling sea below. In that moment, suspended between sky and sea, life and death, Jack made a decision. With a grunt of effort, he reached up and grabbed the harness above Davis's hands. "Let go of me," he yelled. Davis's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "No. Do it," Jack insisted, If we both go down, no one makes it. Let me go and you can get clear." For a split second, Jack saw the conflict in Davis's eyes. Then, with a look of grim determination, the rescue swimmer did something completely unexpected. Instead of letting go, he twisted in the harness, bringing up his free leg to kick at the orca's snout with all his might. The impact was enough. The orca released its grip, falling back into the sea with a tremendous splash. Without the added weight, the winch quickly pulled Jack and Davis the rest of the way to safety. As they were hauled into the helicopter, Jack could hardly believe they'd made it. Mike was there, wrapping him in a fierce hug as the crew worked to close the door and treat Davis's injuries. "I thought, when I saw that orca grab you..." Mike's voice was choked with emotion. Jack patted the young man's back, his own voice gruff with unshed tears. "It's all right, kid. We made it. We're okay." As the helicopter banked and began its journey back to land, Jack looked out the window at the vast expanse of ocean below. He could just make out the dark shapes of the orca pod, still circling where their raft had been. "Quite a story you two have," one of the crew members said, shaking his head in amazement. "The folks back at base aren't going to believe this." Jack let out a weary chuckle. "To be honest, I'm not sure I believe it myself." As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion set in. Jack leaned back, feeling every ache and pain from their ordeal. But beneath the weariness was a profound sense of relief and gratitude. They had faced one of nature's most intelligent and formidable predators and lived to tell the tale. It was an experience Jack knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the Alaskan coast came into view, Jack closed his eyes, letting the steady thrum of the helicopter's rotors wash over him. They were safe, they were alive, and they had one hell of a story to tell. The Coast Guard helicopter thundered through the Alaskan sky, its occupants still reeling from their narrow escape. Jack Hawkins sat with his back against the cold metal interior, his weathered hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb from his system. Beside him, Mike huddled under an emergency blanket, his young face pale but resolute. Across from them, Petty Officer Davis was having his leg examined by a medic, wincing as the fabric of his torn dry suit was cut away. "How are you holding up, Davis?" Jack called over the roar of the rotors. The rescue swimmer gave a pained smile. "I've had worse paper cuts, sir. Nothing a bit of shore leave won't fix." Jack nodded, admiring the man's fortitude. He turned, his attention to the cockpit, where the pilots were engaged in rapid conversation with their base. Something in their tone made Jack's instincts prickle. "What's the situation?" he asked, addressing the crew chief. The man hesitated, glancing towards the cockpit before answering. "We've got a problem, sir. There's a storm system moving in fast. We're not sure we can make it back to base before it hits." As if on cue, the helicopter lurched, buffeted by a sudden gust of wind. Outside the windows, Jack could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, their ominous shapes illuminated by flashes of distant lightning. "How bad?" Mike asked, his voice barely audible over the increasing howl of the wind. The crew chief's face was grim. "Bad enough. The pilots are looking for somewhere to set down until it passes." Jack's mind raced, years of experience kicking in as he assessed their options. "What about Raspberry Island?" he suggested. "There's an old cannery there with a helipad. Might be our best shot." The crew chief relayed the information to the pilots. After a brief discussion, the helicopter banked sharply, changing course towards the island Jack had mentioned. As they approached, the full fury of the storm hit them. Rain lashed against the windows and the helicopter bucked and swayed in the violent wind. Jack could see the strain on the pilots' faces as they fought to keep the aircraft stable. "There!" Mike shouted suddenly, pointing through a break in the clouds. "I can see the island." Raspberry Island loomed before them, its rugged coastline battered by massive waves. The abandoned cannery stood like a sentinel on the shore, its metal roof gleaming dully in the storm's twilight. The pilots began their descent, fighting against the wind with every foot they dropped. Jack gripped his seat tightly, his knuckles white as the ground rushed up to meet them. With a bone-jarring thud, the helicopter touched down on the old helipad. The pilots immediately cut the engines, not wanting to risk the rotors in the powerful gusts. "Everybody out!" the crew chief shouted. "We need to get to shelter before this storm gets any worse." They scrambled from the helicopter, hunched against the driving rain and howling wind. Jack helped support Davis as they made their way towards the cannery. The group huddled together against the elements. As they reached the building, a deafening crack of thunder split the air. Jack looked up just in time to see a bolt of lightning strike the helicopter they had just evacuated. Sparks flew as the aircraft's fuel tank ignited, sending a fireball into the stormy sky. Jesus Christ, Mike breathed, his eyes wide with shock. Inside, now, Jack shouted, urging the group forward. They stumbled through the cannery's rusted doors, the sound of the explosion still ringing in their ears. Inside, the building was dark and musty, the air heavy with the scent of long-abandoned machinery and old fish. Anyone hurt? Davis called out, his rescue training kicking in despite his own injuries. A chorus of negatives answered him as eyes adjusted to the gloom. The crew chief pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal rows of ancient conveyor belts and processing equipment. We need to find a secure room, Jack said, taking charge of the situation. Someplace without windows in case this storm gets worse. They moved deeper into the building, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Eventually they found what looked like an old office, its thick walls and lack of windows offering some protection from the raging storm outside. As they settled in, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stranded on a remote island, their only means of communication and escape destroyed by the lightning strike. So what now? Mike asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Jack ran a hand through his salt-crusted hair, his mind working through their options. We wait out the storm, he said finally. Once it passes, we can try to signal for help. There should be emergency supplies in this place somewhere. Flares, maybe a radio if we're lucky. The group nodded, taking comfort in having a plan, however tentative. They began to organize their meager supplies, rationing out the emergency rations from the helicopter and tending to Davis's injured leg. As night fell, the storm intensified. The old cannery groaned and creaked under the assault of wind and rain, each sound making them jump. Jack found himself pacing the small room, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. You feel it too, don't you? Davis said quietly, watching Jack from where he sat propped against the wall. Jack nodded grimly. Something's not right. This storm, it's not natural. As if in response to his words, a low, haunting sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was a sound Jack knew all too well. The call of an orca. No, he breathed, rushing to the room's single high window. It can't be. But as he peered out into the storm-tossed night, his worst fears were confirmed. There, in the churning waters just offshore, he could make out the distinctive dorsal fins of the orca pod that had pursued them relentlessly. They followed us, Jack said, his voice filled with disbelief. All this way through the storm, they followed us. The others gathered around, their faces a mix of fear and awe as they watched the massive predators circling in the turbulent sea. But how? Mike asked. How could they have known where we were going? Jack shook his head, his mind racing. They're intelligent, more than we give them credit for. They must have followed the helicopter's path. What do they want? One of the pilots asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's jaw clenched as he met the eye of the male orca, its massive dorsal fin cutting through the waves like a knife. Revenge, he said simply. We challenged them, hurt them. In their minds were a threat that needs to be eliminated. A sudden wave crashed against the shore, sending spray high into the air. In the brief illumination provided by a flash of lightning, they saw the full extent of their predicament. The storm surge was pushing the water higher up the beach, eating away at the land between the cannery and the sea. The building, Davis realized aloud. If the water keeps rising, Jack nodded grimly, we'll be trapped. Or worse, the foundation could give way. The gravity of the situation settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They were caught between the fury of the storm and the relentless pursuit of the orcas, with no clear path to safety. We need to move, Jack decided, his voice cutting through the tension. Find higher ground within the building. And we need to find those emergency supplies. Flares, radios, anything that could signal for help. They split into groups, searching the old cannery as quickly as they could. Jack led Mike and one of the pilots through the maze of rusted machinery, their flashlight beams dancing across corroded metal and moldy walls. As they searched, the building groaned ominously, the sound of creaking metal mixing with the crash of waves and the haunting calls of the orcas outside. "Jack!" Mike called out suddenly, his voice tight with fear. "Look!" Jack turned to see water seeping under one of the outer doors, a thin stream that was quickly becoming a flood. "Upstairs," Jack ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." They raced for the stairs, the water rising rapidly behind them. As they reached the second floor, a tremendous crash echoed through the building. Looking back, they saw that a section of the outer wall had given way, allowing a torrent of seawater to pour in. "Keep moving," Jack shouted, urging the others ahead of him. They climbed higher, the flood pursuing them with relentless determination. By the time they reached the top floor, the entire lower level of the cannery was submerged. "Did everyone make it?" Jack called out, doing a quick head count as the group reassembled. To his relief, all were present, though Davis was looking pale from the exertion of climbing with his injured leg. "We found these," the crew chief said, holding up a box of emergency flares and an old hand-crank radio. "Not much, but it's something." Jack nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "We need to get to the roof. It's our best chance of being seen if help comes." As they made their way to the roof access, a chilling sound reached their ears. Mixed with the crash of waves and howl of wind was a new noise, the unmistakable sound of orcas calling to each other, much closer than before. Jack rushed to a window, his heart sinking at what he saw. The storm surge had risen so high that the orcas were now swimming through what had once been the cannery's ground floor. Their massive bodies moved with eerie grace through the submerged halls, their intentions clear. "They're inside the building," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're hunting us." The group stood in stunned silence, the full weight of their situation crashing down upon them. They were trapped at the top of a flooding building, pursued by one of nature's most intelligent and determined predators, with a raging storm cutting off any hope of immediate rescue. As another wave crashed against the building, making the entire structure shudder, Jack knew they had reached the moment of truth. This was their final stand, and the decisions they made in the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. "Listen up," he said, his voice cutting through the fear and uncertainty. "We're not done yet. We've come too far, survived too much to give up now. We're going to get to that roof, we're going to signal for help, and we're going to make it out of this alive. Together." His words seemed to galvanize the group. Even Davis struggled to his feet, determination etched on his face. "What's the plan, Jack?" Mike asked, his earlier fear replaced by a steely resolve. Jack looked around at the faces of his companions, the young fisherman who had become like a son to him, the brave rescue swimmer who had risked everything to save them, the skilled pilots and crew who had flown into danger without hesitation. In that moment he knew that whatever came next, they would face it as one. "We fight," Jack said simply. "We use every trick, every tool at our disposal. We show these orcas, this storm, this whole damn ocean that we're not going down without one hell of a fight." As if in response to his words, a massive orca call echoed through the building, followed by the sound of splintering wood as the predators began to force their way up to the higher levels. Jack hefted a piece of broken machinery, its weight reassuring in his hands. "Let's move. We've got a roof to reach and a rescue to signal, and God help any overgrown fish that gets in our way." With renewed determination, the group began to move towards the roof access, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. As they climbed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next would be the stuff of legends, a tale of man versus nature that would be told for years to come. Whether they would live to tell that tale themselves remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: they would face whatever came next together, their will to survive burning as bright and fierce as the storm that raged around them. First rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the turbulent Alaskan waters in hues of gold and crimson. The storm that had raged through the night was finally beginning to subside, leaving in its wake a world transformed. The old cannery on Raspberry Island stood battered but not broken, its metal skeleton exposed in places where the storm had torn away walls and roofing. On the highest point of the building's roof, a small group of survivors huddled together, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief at the ordeal they had endured. Jack Hawkins, his weathered face lined with new cuts and bruises, stood at the edge of the roof, his eyes scanning the churning waters below. "Any sign of them?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse from a night of shouting over the storm. Jack shook, his head grimly. "Nothing. But that doesn't mean they're gone." The orcas that had pursued them with such relentless determination had disappeared beneath the waves as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving the survivors in a state of uneasy limbo. Petty Officer Davis limped to Jack's side, his injured leg hastily bandaged with strips torn from his dry suit. "How long do you think before the Coast Guard realizes we're missing?" Jack squinted at the lightening sky, doing mental calculations. "They'll have noticed we didn't make it back to base last night. With the storm clearing, they'll start search and rescue operations at first light. Question is, how long before they think to look here?" As if in answer to his question, a faint sound caught their attention. At first barely audible over the lapping of waves and the creaking of the damaged building, it soon resolved into an unmistakable rhythm. The steady thrum of helicopter rotors. "There!" Mike shouted, pointing to a spot on the horizon where a small, dark shape was rapidly growing larger. The group erupted into action. The crew chief grabbed the emergency flares they had salvaged, handing them out quickly. "Wait for my signal," he instructed. "We want to make sure they're close enough to see us." As the helicopter drew nearer, Jack felt a surge of hope. They had survived the storm, outsmarted the orcas, and now rescue was at hand. But even as the thought crossed his mind, a familiar dark shape broke the surface of the water near the shore. "They're back," Jack said, his voice tight with tension. The male orca, its towering dorsal fin unmistakable even at a distance, led its pod in a tight circle around the island. Their intelligent eyes seemed to be fixed on the approaching helicopter, their intentions unclear, but undoubtedly dangerous. "We need to warn the chopper," Davis said, reaching for the hand-crank radio they had found. But before he could turn it on, the orcas made their move. With a coordinated burst of speed that left Jack in awe despite the danger, the pod surged towards the helicopter's likely landing zone. "No," Jack breathed, realizing their plan. "They're going to try to keep it from landing." The helicopter was close now, close enough for Jack to make out the Coast Guard insignia on its side. He could see the pilot's face through the windshield, scanning the wreckage of the cannery for signs of survivors. "Light the flares," the crew chief shouted. "Now!" The roof of the cannery erupted in a blaze of red light as the survivors ignited, their flares waving them frantically to catch the pilot's attention. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack thought they might not have been seen. Then the helicopter banked sharply, turning directly towards them. Relief flooded through Jack, but it was short-lived. As the helicopter approached, the orcas launched, themselves out of the water in a series of spectacular breaches, their massive bodies creating walls of spray directly in the aircraft's path. "My God," one of the pilots whispered, watching the display with a mixture of awe and terror. The helicopter pulled up sharply, narrowly avoiding a collision with one of the leaping orcas. It circled the island, the pilot clearly searching for a safe approach. Jack's mind raced, years of experience on the water kicking into high gear. He turned to the group, his eyes blazing with determination. "We need to create a distraction. Give the chopper a chance to land." "How?" Mike asked, his young face a mask of determination. Despite the fear in his eyes, Jack's gaze fell on a pile of debris they had gathered during the night. Broken machinery, pieces of metal roofing, anything that could potentially be used as a weapon. "We make noise. We make ourselves targets. We give those orcas something to focus on besides the helicopter." Understanding dawned on the faces around him. Without a word, they began grabbing pieces of debris, ready to follow Jack's lead. "Wait for my signal," Jack instructed, his eyes never leaving the circling helicopter. "When I give the word, we make as much noise as we can. Bang the metal, shout, do whatever it takes to get their attention." The group tensed, watching as the helicopter made another pass, lower this time but still wary of the leaping orcas. "Now!" Jack roared. The air was suddenly filled with a cacophony of sound. Metal clanged against metal, voices shouted and screamed, creating a wall of noise that cut through the morning air. Jack himself hefted a large piece of machinery, bringing it down again and again on the metal roof with all the strength he could muster. The effect was immediate. The orcas, startled by the sudden assault on their sensitive hearing, broke off their attack on the helicopter. The male, its dorsal fin slicing through the water like a knife, led the pod in a wide circle around the island as if reassessing the situation. "It's working," Mike shouted over the din. "The chopper's coming in." Sure enough, the Coast Guard helicopter was descending rapidly, taking advantage of the momentary distraction. Jack felt a surge of triumph, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Keep it up," he yelled to the others. "Don't let up until that chopper's on the ground." The noise reached a fever pitch as the helicopter touched down on a relatively flat piece of ground near the cannery. The downdraft from its rotors whipped up a spray of seawater, adding to the chaos of the scene. As soon as the skids touched earth, the helicopter's door slid open and a Coast Guard rescue team spilled out, moving with practiced efficiency despite the unusual circumstances. "Go!" Jack shouted to the others. "Get to the chopper! I'll cover the rear!" The group began to move, helping Davis limp across the treacherous rooftop towards the makeshift ladder they had constructed during the night. Jack brought up the rear, still banging his piece of metal, keeping a wary eye on the circling orcas. The rescue team met them halfway, strong hands reaching out to help them down from the roof. Jack could see the shock and disbelief on their faces as they took in the survivors' battered appearance and the bizarre scene unfolding around them. "What in God's name happened here?" one of the rescuers shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Long story," Jack yelled back. "Let's get out of here and I'll tell you all about it." They were almost to the helicopter when Jack heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive call of the male orca, closer than it had any right to be. He spun around, his eyes widening in horror at what he saw. The male orca had broken away from the pod and was surging towards the shore with terrifying speed, its massive body cutting through the water like a torpedo. "Look out!" Jack shouted, but his warning was drowned out by the roar of the helicopter's engines. Time seemed to slow as Jack watched the orca launch itself out of the water, its enormous body silhouetted against the dawn sky. It was aimed directly at the rescue team and the survivors, a final desperate attempt to prevent their escape. In that moment, Jack knew what he had to do. With a surge of adrenaline, he broke away from the group, sprinting towards the water's edge. "Jack, no!" He heard Mike's anguished cry behind him, but he didn't look back. Jack reached the shore just as the orca began its descent. With all the strength he could muster, he hurled his piece of metal directly at the orca's sensitive snout. The improvised weapon struck home with a resounding clang. The orca, caught off guard by the sudden pain, twisted in midair. Instead of crashing into the rescue team, it plunged back into the water mere feet from where Jack stood. The impact sent a massive wave crashing over Jack, knocking him off his feet. He felt himself being pulled into the churning water, the orca's massive form looming beside him. Underwater, everything was chaos. Jack could feel the orca's presence, could sense its anger and frustration. He kicked desperately, fighting to reach the surface, his lungs burning for air. Just when he thought he couldn't hold his breath any longer, strong hands grabbed him, pulling him up. He broke the surface with a gasp, coughing and sputtering. "I've got you, old man." Mike's voice came from beside him. The young fisherman, along with one of the Coast Guard rescuers, was dragging Jack back towards shore. As they stumbled onto land, Jack saw the male orca resurface a short distance away. For a moment their eyes met, man and beast, adversaries who had pushed each other to the very limits of survival. There was something almost like respect in the orca's gaze before it turned and dove, rejoining its pod as they swam out to deeper waters. "Come on," the Coast Guard rescuer urged, supporting Jack as they made their way to the waiting helicopter. "Let's get you out of here." The next few minutes passed in a blur. Jack found himself being lifted into the helicopter, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders as the medical team began to check him over. He caught glimpses of the others, Mike, grinning despite his exhaustion, Davis receiving treatment for his leg, the pilots and crew chief recounting their ordeal to the astonished rescue team. As the helicopter lifted off, Jack looked out the window at the receding island. The cannery stood as a battered monument to their night of terror and triumph. In the waters below, he could just make out the dorsal fins of the orca pod, swimming away into the vast Alaskan Sea. "Quite a story you've got there," the Coast Guard medic said as he checked Jack's vitals. "Survived a shipwreck, a storm, and a pod of aggressive orcas. It's a miracle you all made it. Jack managed a tired smile. Not a miracle, just a bunch of stubborn folks who weren't ready to give up. As the helicopter turned towards the mainland, Jack felt the weight of the ordeal finally settling on him. His body ached, his mind was exhausted, but beneath it all was a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. They had faced nature at its most brutal and cunning. They had stared death in the eye, be it in the form of storm-tossed seas, or the intelligent gaze of a determined predator. And they had survived. It was a tale that would be told and retold, a testament to human resilience and the unbreakable bonds forged in the face of adversity. Jack leaned back, allowing himself to relax for the first time in what felt like ages. As the Alaskan coastline came into view, he knew that while the immediate danger had passed, the impact of their ordeal would linger. There would be debriefings, interviews, probably even scientific inquiries into the unusual behavior of the orcas. But for now, he was content to simply breathe, to feel the solid floor of the helicopter beneath him, and to bask in the simple joy of survival. As he drifted off into an exhausted sleep, lulled by the steady thrum of the rotors, Jack's last thoughts were of the sea, its beauty, its danger, and the profound respect he had gained for its most intelligent inhabitants. The orca pod might have been their adversaries, but they had also been their teachers, pushing them to the very limits of human endurance and ingenuity. In that crucible of survival, Jack and his companions had discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. As the helicopter carried them toward safety and the promise of reunion with loved ones, Jack knew that while he might return to the sea someday, he would never again take its power for granted. The Alaskan waters had tested him, nearly broken him, but in the end, they had also renewed him. With that thought, Jack surrendered to sleep, the first rays of the new day warming his face through the helicopter's window. A survivor, a changed man, carrying with him a tale of man versus nature that would be remembered for years to come. The fluorescent lights of the Kodiak Island Hospital buzzed softly overhead, as Jack Hawkins sat on the edge of his bed, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. It had been 3 days since their rescue from Raspberry Island. 3 days of tests, interviews, and fitful sleep plagued by dreams of churning water and gleaming teeth. A soft knock at the door drew Jack from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice still rough from the ordeal. The door swung open to reveal Mike, looking far better than he had on the island. The young fisherman's face broke into a wide grin at the sight of his mentor. "Jack, they're finally letting you out of this place?" Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "About time too. I was starting to forget what the outside world looks like." Mike chuckled, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes as he took in Jack's appearance. The older man looked tired, the lines on his face seeming deeper than before. "How are you feeling, really?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "I'm alive, which is more than I thought I'd be able to say a few days ago, but..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "But..." Mike prompted gently. "But I can't shake it, Mike," Jack admitted, his voice low. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I can feel the water, hear those orcas." He shook his head as if trying to dislodge the memories. Mike nodded solemnly, understanding all too well. He'd been having his own nightmares, though he'd been reluctant to admit it. "Have you talked to anyone about it?" "The doctors mentioned something about counseling." Jack snorted, some of his old gruffness returning. "Counseling? What good is talking going to do? We survived. End of story." Before Mike could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Dr. Sarah Chen, the marine biologist who had been brought in to study their encounter with the orcas. "Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Taylor," she greeted them, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. "I hope I'm not interrupting?" Jack waved her in, grateful for the distraction. "Not at all, Doc. What's the verdict? Am I free to go?" Dr. Chen smiled, glancing down at the chart in her hands. "Physically, you're in remarkably good shape considering what you've been through. A few more days of rest, and you should be back to normal." "But?" Jack prompted, sensing there was more. Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "But I'm concerned about the psychological impact of your experience. What you went through was extraordinary, and it's natural to have some lingering effects. Jack's jaw tightened, but before he could dismiss her concerns, Mike spoke up. "She's right, Jack. We all need to talk about what happened. It's not just going to go away." For a moment, Jack looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Maybe you're right," he conceded. "But not here, not in this damn hospital room." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration wants to conduct a full debriefing on your encounter with the orcas. They've set up a meeting room at their local office. It might be a good opportunity to process everything in a more neutral environment." Jack considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Doc. When do they want us?" "This afternoon, if you're up for it," Dr. Chen replied. "The whole team will be there. You, Mike, Petty Officer Davis, and the helicopter crew." Jack stood up, stretching muscles that were still sore from their ordeal. "No time like the present, I suppose. Let's get this over with." The NOAA office was a modern building overlooking the harbor, its large windows offering a panoramic view of the very waters that had nearly claimed their lives. As Jack, Mike, and the others filed into the conference room, they were greeted by a panel of scientists and officials, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. At the head of the table sat Dr. Marcus Reeves, a renowned expert on orca behavior. His piercing blue eyes seemed to take in every detail as the survivors settled into their seats. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming," Dr. Reeves began, his voice carrying the crisp accent of the East Coast. "We understand that reliving your experience may be difficult, but your insights are invaluable to our understanding of orca behavior." Jack nodded stiffly, his discomfort evident. "Let's just get on with it, shall we?" Dr. Reeves seemed unfazed by Jack's brusqueness. "Of course. Perhaps we could start at the beginning. Mr. Hawkins, could you walk us through your initial encounter with the orca pod?" Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing back to that fateful day on the Sea Whisper. As he began to speak, the words came haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as the memories flooded back. He described the first sighting of the orcas, their initial curiosity that quickly turned to aggression. He recounted the heart-stopping moment when the male orca first rammed their boat, the frantic attempts to scare them off, and the sickening realization that they were being hunted. As Jack spoke, the room fell into a hushed silence, broken only by the scratch of pens on notepads and the occasional murmur of astonishment. Even those who had heard the story before seemed captivated by the first-hand account. When Jack reached the part about their desperate escape in the life raft, Mike chimed in, adding details that Jack had missed in the chaos of the moment. Together, they painted a vivid picture of their night adrift, the constant fear of the circling predators, and the slim hope of rescue that kept them going. Petty Officer Davis took over when it came to the dramatic helicopter rescue, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he described the heart-stopping moment when the orcas nearly brought down the aircraft. Throughout the recounting, Dr. Reeves and his team listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. When the survivors finally fell silent, the scientist leaned back in his chair, a look of deep contemplation on his face. "Remarkable," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, addressing the group, he said, "What you've described is unprecedented in our records of orca behavior. The level of coordination, the sustained aggression, the apparent desire for revenge, for lack of a better term. It's extraordinary." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "With all due respect, Doc, we didn't come here for a science lesson. We lived it. What we want to know is, why? Why did they come after us like that?" Dr. Reeves nodded, his expression serious. "That's the million-dollar question, Mr. Hawkins. Orcas are highly intelligent social creatures. They're known to hold grudges, to remember faces and boats that have wronged them. But the behavior you described goes beyond anything we've documented before." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Based on your account, it seems the initial conflict, when you tried to protect your catch, triggered something in the pod. The male, in particular, appears to have perceived you as a threat to its dominance or to the pod's food source." Mike leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "But we've had run-ins with orcas before. They've never reacted like this." Dr. Reeves nodded. "That's what makes this case so unique. It's possible that this particular pod had previous negative interactions with humans that we're unaware of. Or perhaps there were environmental factors, changes in their food supply, for instance, that made them more aggressive. Jack listened to the scientist's theories, a mix of emotions churning inside him. Part of him wanted answers, a rational explanation for the terror they had endured. But another part, a primal part awakened by their ordeal, resisted the attempt to categorize and analyze their experience. "Does it matter?" he found himself saying, his voice cutting through the academic discussion. "Does it really matter why they did it? They hunted us. They were intelligent, yeah, but they were also killers. Pure and simple." A hush fell over the room at Jack's outburst. Dr. Reeves regarded him thoughtfully for a moment before responding. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand your feelings. What you went through was traumatic, and it's natural to want to simplify it, to cast the orcas as mere villains in your story." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "But I urge you to consider another perspective. These animals, as intelligent as they are, were acting on instinct and learned behavior. They perceived a threat and responded. Understanding why they behaved as they did isn't just academic curiosity. It's crucial for preventing similar incidents in the future and for our broader understanding of these complex creatures." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but found he didn't have the words. Instead, it was Mike who spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "So, what do we do with this information? How do we make sure this doesn't happen to someone else?" Dr. Reeves smiled, clearly pleased by the question. "That's exactly what we're here to figure out. Your experience, as harrowing as it was, provides us with valuable data. We'll be analyzing every detail, looking for patterns and triggers that we can use to develop better guidelines for interactions between humans and orcas in the wild." As the scientists continued to outline their plans for further study, Jack found his mind wandering. He gazed out the window at the harbor, watching the fishing boats come and go. For the first time since their rescue, he felt a twinge of longing for the sea. The meeting continued for several more hours, with each member of the team recounting their perspective on the events. By the time they finished, the sun was setting over the harbor, casting long shadows across the conference room. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Reeves approached Jack, his manner more personal than professional. "Mr. Hawkins, I know this hasn't been easy for you, but I want you to know that your experience, your insights, they're invaluable. You've given us a unique window into orca behavior, one that could save lives in the future." Jack nodded, not entirely comfortable with the praise, but recognizing the sincerity behind it. "Just doing what I had to do to survive, Doc. But if it helps, well, I guess some good came out of it after all." As they left the NOAA office, Jack found himself hanging back, letting the others go ahead. Mike noticed and waited for him, concern evident on his young face. "You okay, Jack?" he asked quietly. Jack took a deep breath of the salty air, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, kid. I thought talking about it would help, you know? Give us some closure or whatever, but now..." Mike waited patiently as Jack gathered his thoughts. "Now I can't stop thinking about them," Jack continued. "Those orcas, they're still out there somewhere." He turned to Mike, a conflicted look in his eyes. "Part of me is terrified at the thought of going back out on the water, but another part wants to go back." Mike finished for him, understanding dawning on his face. Jack nodded, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "Crazy, right, after everything we went through?" Mike shook his head, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Not crazy. You're a fisherman, Jack. The sea's in your blood. This was just another storm to weather." Jack chuckled softly at that. Some storm. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice low but determined. "I'm going back out there, Mike. Not right away, but soon. I need to face it to prove to myself that they haven't beaten me." Mike nodded, unsurprised. "I know. And when you do, I'll be right there with you." Jack looked at his young friend, seeing not just the eager kid he'd taken under his wing, but a man who had faced death alongside him and come out stronger. "I appreciate that, Mike. I really do." As they made their way back to their temporary lodgings, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The nightmares might not be gone, the memories still raw, but he had taken the first step towards reclaiming his life, his livelihood. The sea had challenged him, pushed him to his limits, but it hadn't broken him. And those orcas, as terrifying as they had been, had also shown him the depths of his own resilience, the strength of the human spirit when faced with nature's most formidable predators. Jack knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more debriefings, more questions, maybe even more nightmares. But he also knew that he wouldn't face it alone. He had Mike, he had the respect and support of the scientific community, and most importantly, he had his own indomitable will. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Jack's dreams were not of churning waters and gleaming teeth, but of open seas and new horizons. The orcas were still there, in the periphery of his consciousness, but they were no longer monsters to be feared. They were a challenge to be respected, a reminder of the raw power and intelligence of the natural world. And Jack Hawkins, seasoned fisherman and survivor, was ready to meet that challenge head-on. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jack and the others gave interviews to local and national media, their story capturing the imagination of people around the world. Marine biologists and behaviorists flocked to Kodiak, eager to glean any additional insights from the survivors. Through it all, Jack found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was proud of how they had survived, of the strength and ingenuity they had shown in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. On the other, he couldn't shake a deep-seated unease, a newfound respect for the power and unpredictability of the ocean he had long considered his second home. It was during this time that Jack received an unexpected visitor. He was sitting on the porch of his rented cabin, watching the sun set over the harbor, when a car pulled up. From it emerged an elderly man, his weathered face creased with age and experience. "Jack Hawkins," the man called out as he approached. "Name's Tom Carver. I was hoping we could talk." Jack eyed the newcomer warily. "If you're another reporter," Tom held up his hands, a gentle smile on his face. "Nothing like that, son. I'm just an old fisherman like yourself. Been working these waters for nigh on 60 years. Intrigued, despite himself, Jack gestured for Tom to take a seat. "What can I do for you, Mr. Carver?" The old man settled into the chair with a grateful sigh. "Call me Tom. And it's more what I can do for you, I reckon." At Jack's quizzical look, Tom continued, "I heard about what happened to you and your crew. Terrible business that, but not unheard of." Jack leaned forward, his interest piqued. "You've seen something like this before?" Tom nodded slowly, his gaze distant as if looking back through the years. "Was about 30 years ago. I was out with my crew, good day's fishing. We'd had a few run-ins with orcas before, nothing serious, but this time..." He shook his head. This time was different. As Tom recounted his tale, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The details were different, but the essence was the same. A pod of orcas, far more aggressive than normal, pursuing them relentlessly. "How did you get away?" Jack asked when Tom finished his story. The old fisherman's eyes twinkled. "Luck, mostly, and a bit of quick thinking. We managed to make it to a narrow channel, too shallow for the orcas to follow. Scraped the hell out of our hull, but we made it." Jack sat back, processing this new information. "Why are you telling me this, Tom?" Tom regarded him seriously. "Because I know that look in your eye, son. You're thinking about giving it up, aren't you? Leaving the sea behind?" Jack started to deny it, but the words died in his throat. The truth was, he had been considering it. The thought of going back out there, of facing those waters again. "Listen to me, Jack," Tom said, his voice gentle but firm. "The sea, she's a harsh mistress. She'll test you, push you to your limits. And sometimes, like with those orcas, she'll show you things that seem beyond understanding. But that's not a reason to turn your back on her." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "It's a reason to learn, to grow, to become a better fisherman, a better man. You survived something incredible, Jack. Don't let fear rob you of the life you love." Jack sat in silence for a long moment, Tom's words sinking in. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I can, Tom. Every time I close my eyes, I see those orcas. I feel the water closing in around me. How do I get past that?" Tom nodded understandingly. "It ain't easy, son, but let me tell you something. Those memories, they're like scars. They'll fade with time. but they'll always be a part of you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Jack looked at him skeptically. How do you figure that? Because, Tom said, leaning back in his chair, those scars are a reminder of what you've survived. They're proof of your strength, your resilience. And they'll make you a better fisherman. He gestured towards the harbor, where fishing boats were returning with the day's catch. You've seen the worst the sea can throw at you, and you lived to tell the tale. That knowledge, that experience, it's invaluable. You'll be more cautious, more prepared, and you'll have a deeper respect for the ocean and its creatures. Jack mulled over Tom's words, finding a kernel of truth in them. The experience had changed him, there was no denying that. But maybe, just maybe, it had changed him for the better. So what do I do now? Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom smiled, a glint of challenge in his old eyes. You do what fishermen have done for thousands of years, son. You get back on your boat, you sail out into those waters, and you face your fears head on. He stood up, groaning slightly as his aged joints protested. But you don't have to do it alone. Take your crew, take that young fella Mike. Hell, I'll even come along if you want. Sometimes facing your demons is easier with friends by your side. Jack stood as well, feeling a spark of his old determination flickering to life. You know what, Tom? I might just take you up on that offer. As Tom prepared to leave, he turned back to Jack one last time. Remember, Jack, the sea doesn't give her lessons easy, but for those willing to learn, she's the best teacher there is. With a final nod, Tom climbed back into his car and drove off, leaving Jack standing on the porch, his mind churning with new possibilities. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he found his thoughts not on the terrifying memories of the ORCA attack, but on the future. He thought about the feel of a deck beneath his feet, the salt spray on his face, the thrill of a good catch, and for the first time since their ordeal, he felt a glimmer of excitement at the prospect of returning to the sea. The nightmares might not be gone, the memories still raw, but Jack Hawkins was a fisherman. The sea was in his blood, and no, ORCA, no matter how fearsome, could change that. As he drifted off to sleep, Jack made a decision. Tomorrow, he would call Mike. It was time to start planning their return to the waters. The orcas might still be out there, but so was he. And this time he'd be ready. Not just to survive, but to thrive in the world he loved, armed with newfound respect, knowledge, and determination. As the sound of waves lapping against the shore lulled him to sleep, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The sea had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it hadn't broken him. And now, with the wisdom of experience and the support of his friends, he was ready to embrace it once again, in all its beautiful, terrible glory. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Alaskan summer day. Jack woke early, feeling more rested than he had in weeks. The conversation with Tom had stirred something in him, reigniting a passion he'd feared lost. After a quick breakfast, Jack picked up his phone and dialed Mike's number. The young fisherman answered on the second ring, his voice still groggy with sleep. "Jack, everything okay?" Mike asked, concern evident in his tone. "Everything's fine, kid," Jack reassured him. "Better than fine, actually. I've been thinking, how would you feel about getting back out on the water?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Jack began to worry he'd misjudged Mike's readiness. But then Mike's voice came back, strong and clear. "I thought you'd never ask," he said, and Jack could hear the grin in his voice. "When do we leave?" Jack chuckled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Not so fast, we've got some preparation to do first. Meet me at the docks in an hour. We've got a boat to check over." An hour later, Jack stood on the weathered planks of the Kodiak harbor, breathing in the familiar scents of salt water, fish, and diesel fuel. He spotted Mike making his way down the dock, a spring in his step that had been missing since their ordeal. "Morning, Jack," Mike called out as he approached. "So, what's the plan?" Jack gestured towards a boat moored nearby. It wasn't the Sea Whisper. That vessel was long gone, claimed by the Alaskan waters. But it was similar in size and design. "Meet our new home away from home. She's not much to look at yet, but with a little work." Mike whistled appreciatively as he ran, his hand along the boat's hull. "She's got good bones. What are you thinking of calling her?" Jack paused, considering. The name had come to him in the night, a testament to their survival, and a nod to the creatures that had nearly claimed their lives. I was thinking, orcas. Lesson. Mike raised an eyebrow, then nodded slowly. Fitting. A reminder of what we've been through and what we've learned. Exactly, Jack agreed. Now let's see what kind of shape she's in. We've got a lot of work to do before she's seaworthy. For the next several hours, Jack and Mike threw themselves into inspecting every inch of the boat. They checked the engine, examined the hull for weak spots, and took inventory of the equipment on board. It was hard work, but Jack found it deeply satisfying. With every task completed, he felt more connected to the sea, more ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the harbor, Jack and Mike sat on the deck sharing a thermos of coffee. So, Mike said, breaking a comfortable silence, when do you think we'll be ready to take her out? Jack took a long sip of coffee, considering the question. Could be a week, could be a month, depends on how much work she needs, and he paused, choosing his words carefully. How ready we are. Mike nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. You know, Jack, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about the orcas. Jack tensed slightly, but forced himself to remain calm. Oh yeah? What about them? I think, Mike started, then stopped, gathering his thoughts. I think we were given a gift, in a way. Not many people get to see orcas like we did, to really understand their intelligence, their power. Jack snorted. Some gift. Nearly cost us our lives. True, Mike conceded. But it also showed us what we're capable of, how strong we can be when pushed to our limits. And now, we have knowledge that most fishermen will never have. We understand those waters and the creatures in them in a way few others do. Jack was silent for a long moment, mulling over Mike's words. Finally, he nodded slowly. You might be right, kid. Doesn't make it any less terrifying to think about going back. Out there, though, Mike clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. That's why we do it together. We watch each other's backs just like we did on that island. As the last light faded from the sky, Jack felt a sense of certainty settle over him. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Mike by his side and the lessons of their ordeal to guide them, they stood a fighting chance. All right, Jack said, standing up and stretching. First light tomorrow, we start work on getting this old girl ready for sea. We've got a lot to do if we want to be ready for the fall fishing season. Mike grinned, jumping to his feet. Aye, aye, Captain. We'll have the orca's lesson shipshape in no time. As they made their way back down the dock, Jack found himself looking forward to the days ahead. The sea had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it hadn't broken them, and now, armed with hard-won knowledge and a deeper respect for the ocean's power, they were ready to embrace their lives as fishermen once again. The orcas might still be out there, somewhere in the vast Alaskan waters. But Jack Hawkins and Mike Taylor would be out there too, wiser, stronger, and more prepared than ever before. They had faced nature's ultimate predator and survived. Whatever challenges the sea might throw at them next, they would face them together, aboard the orca's lesson. As Jack fell asleep that night, his dreams were not of terror and pursuit, but of open waters, good catches, and the quiet companionship of a trusted crew. The nightmare was over, a new chapter was beginning, and Jack Hawkins, seasoned fisherman and survivor, was ready to write it.